Okay, good morning. We are in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, chapter 299, Reish Tzadik Tes. We're holding Halacha Dalet, the fourth Halacha. So we began discussing the laws of eating toward the end of Shabbos. And the basic principle is there are two principles that come together to make this Halacha. Well, first of all, Malka Bat Yonah. Did I get the share for her? That she should be well, Malka Bat Yonah. Mm-hmm. She's Baruch Hashem good, and she will remain good. Okay, so there are two principles that come together to make this halacha. Principle number one is that as soon as the obligation for anything arrives and sets upon you, you're required to refrain from anything until you get that requirement done. Specifically in this context, eating and drinking. Right? We used this example before. You wake up in the morning on Sukkot morning, you can't eat until you shake Lulav Nesek. Rosh Hashanah morning, you can't until you blow shofar. Regular morning, you can't eat until you say Shema. When an obligation comes upon you, you're supposed to refrain from eating or drinking until that obligation is fulfilled. And the same thing is true of Havdalah. So as soon as the obligation for Havdalah arrives, one has to refrain from eating and drinking until one does Havdalah. Except for water, a person can drink water. We established that. Because water is so temporary that it doesn't cause any distraction from your requirement that comes later, or the requirement that you will fulfill later. That's principle one. Principle two is that you can extend your Shabbos, which means if you started your meal at a point that is allowed, then you can continue going into Motzei Shabbos and do Havdalah at the end, because you're extending Shabbos. Right. So this is the balance. If you start eating before your obligation for Havdalah, continue going. You may continue going. If you haven't started eating and your obligation for Havdalah arrived, you may not start. And if you did start, then you have to stop as soon as you remember that you're supposed to make Havdalah. So when does the obligation for Havdalah begin? Oh, hold on a second. One of the teachers is stuck outside. Mind someone going to? Yeah. I'll go. Which side? This. I'm not sure if you're going to the lobby. Look outside. Which window? Which door? Thank you. Right. So now that question becomes, when does the obligation for Havdalah begin? Well, you might say it seems obvious that it begins when Shabbos is over, but not so, because the last hour of Shabbos or so, from sunset until nightfall, is a doubt. Is it still part of Shabbos, or is Shabbos over? And we take the stringency in both directions. Namely, even though you cannot make Havdalah even though we don't make Havdalah, and Shabbos isn't over until complete nightfall, but we refrain from eating from the beginning of that time, sunset. From Shkia, we want you to stop eating. We did mention that there is an opinion which says that you may start eating even after sunset, and therefore one can rely. There are those that rely on that. Nonetheless, the primary opinion is to stop eating before sunset. Yeah, this is what we established so far.
When we're sitting in Shabbos,
such I mentioned last time. So
I remember if you mentioned that.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying. So we mentioned this. So the truth is, you should start eating before sunset. But because there's an opinion which says you can rely, that goes all the way till the end. I don't know, you have to jump across the table and smack a fruit out of someone's mouth, because there is the opinion which says you're allowed to continue eat. You're allowed to eat all the way till absolute nightfall. There's that opinion, so at least there's something to rely on. Now, we mentioned this. We asked when he says, "Yeah, all good."
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
What is the official nightfall? When you see the 3 stars, or when the sun really sets?
So the sun sets is the beginning, and nightfall is the end. Right. That's the time period that's in doubt. Right. Sunset till nightfall. So sunset. Okay. Good question. Sunset is. We're not going to go down the road, but the short of it is when the sun goes below the horizon. Let's just go with that view. And nightfall is when it's completely dark, which is when you see 3 stars. Okay. But today, none of those standards really apply. At least not really, because we have buildings that block our view of the horizon, and we have artificial light that the city produces that prevent us from viewing the stars properly. So there are mathematical equations we do to determine the exact times, all of which is available on Chabad.org or in your local calendar. Okay, so we asked, he said there's a difference between eating, or once you start eating, if you started when it's permissible, you don't have to stop when the time for Havdalah comes, because you started eating permissibly. Drinking, even if you're drinking in such a manner that you're permanent, that is to say you sat down for a glass of wine, you still have to stop when the time comes. Right? We said that. Now, we asked, what does it mean when he says that if you started eating when it's permissible, you're allowed to continue? Does that mean specifically you washed for Hamaitzi? Or does it mean even if I sat down to eat a piece of cake, which is mezainis? The Alter Rebbe is not clear. We left the question open-ended. Right? Gimel emailed me, as you would expect, that there's a dispute.
Liquids is clear.
Liquids is clear. He says, stop when nightfall comes. Even if you're drinking a permanent type drink, you're drinking wine, whiskey, whatever. Nightfall comes, you got to stop. When it comes to eating, he says, if you started permissibly, you're allowed to continue. What kind of eating is he talking about? He doesn't say. So let's look at halacha 2, and I'll tell you why I think that any eating, even mezainis, if you started when you're allowed to continue. I'll tell you why I think that, based on Alter Rebbe. So look at halacha 2. Halacha 2 is where he first distinguishes, where he introduces this idea that you have to stop. And then he introduces the second opinion, which says that you're allowed to continue, you're allowed to eat up until nightfall itself, not just before sunset. And then he says at the end, you should follow the first opinion that says to stop by sunset, not just go until nightfall, yeah? So let's see how he phrases it. Look in the beginning of the Hebrew base. Even if he was sitting and drinking while it was still day, he has to stop when it hits sunset, that intermediary time, because maybe it's nighttime. But if he was sitting and eating when day started, doesn't say doesn't say if he established a meal,
Right.
which is the way he would describe sitting down to wash. He's sitting and eating. You don't have to stop even from your drinking until it becomes actual night, even when it comes actual night, and you may continue into the nighttime because you started permissibly.
So the liquid's attached to the food?
That's for sure. But what kind of food is he talking about?
Right.
Washed or regular eating? He says, if you were sitting and eating. So he does say sitting as opposed to just snacking. So you're sitting to eat. But it doesn't say kavasudasa. It doesn't say if you established a meal, which is usually the way you describe washing.
Or they described it also as like being anchored to.
Right. Doesn't use that word. Doesn't say even kava, like you established. Just say yoshev, you're sitting.
Does he use washing anywhere else?
No. Oh, so where does he use washing? Now, 1 second, before we get to where he uses washing, then again, look at the 2 paragraphs later. V'yesh matirin. I'm sorry, no, continue going. Where it says, L'divrei hakol, according to all opinions, L'divrei hakol, kishmagia ba'ad halelo, when it comes actual night, tzarech afilu lahafsik im haya kovel l'shtia b'vad. He has to stop, even if he was established for drinking. Right? So in other words, he's telling us that when it comes to drinking, establishment isn't enough. When it comes to eating, he doesn't even use the word establishment, he just says sitting. Which again reinforces my thinking that you don't have to wash necessarily for your meal to have begun kosher in permissibility to allow it to continue, even if it's mezainis. Right? Then he says, so what does he use washing? He uses washing that if you began to eat when you weren't allowed to, and then you remembered, you have to stop to make Havdalah. But what if you washed and you made Hamaitzi, and then remember you have to make Havdalah? So there he said, eat some bread and then go make Havdalah. That's the only time he mentions washing. So why is he mentioning washing here? Because it's an even. It's here. It's even though you've washed and made hamaitzi, or I should say rather the other way around. Because you washed and said hamaitzi, therefore you should eat the bread before you make Havdalah, even though you remembered and you're supposed to stop when you remember.
Not to say the bracha in vain.
Not that the hamaitzi doesn't come in vain. It's the only time he mentions washing. but not when he talks about setting your meal. That's why I believe it would seem correct.
Otherwise, you mentioned Moshe.
Otherwise, or you would use the term kavasudasai. He established his meal as opposed to yoshev ha'ochel. He's sitting and eating. Doesn't describe it as a meal. He describes it as sitting and eating, as opposed to you established your meal, which is the terminology he's been using many times. For example, when it came to like the brachas extending from one room to the next, he would use the term kavasudasai. You established your meal here. He doesn't use that term here. He just uses yoshev ha'ochel, sitting and eating. That's why I assume that if you start, so to your point, if the person by Shalosh Shabbos made a bracha mezainis before sunset, then there's completely no problem. He can continue eating and drinking into sunset because he started eating while it was still allowed, even into dark. Yes, because once you started your eating when it was allowed, you may continue going as far as you want. It's only once the obligation of Havdalah hits, that you may not start, which maybe the Havdalah hits when you hit sunset. But if you started eating before sunset, and assuming that started eating includes making mezainis, then you can keep on going even after it's nightfall. In other words, if Farbrengen can continue.
Just talking about
So your
mezainis,
Shabbos is
it
continuing.
could be any shekel.
Okay.
Any meal.
Food item.
So that question becomes: does the same thing apply? Does the same thing apply to fruit? If you're using my logic, then why shouldn't it apply to fruit also? And the answer is, I have no reason to say not. I have no reason to say not.
So that second way.
Maybe, but he does use the term yoshev oichel, sitting and eating, as opposed to oichel, just eating. He does say yoshev oichel, you're sitting and eating. He doesn't say kavasadasa, you established a meal, so it's not as far as washing, but he does say sitting and eating, which means you sat down to eat X. So I would imagine if Farbrengen would qualify, even if you're not necessarily eating mezainis, let's just say. I'll take it a step further. Rabbi Kippel, when he emailed me, he said that the opinion which says that mezainis counts as eating enough, that if you started early, you're allowed to continue, their logic is because you're allowed to have mezainis for Shalosh Shabbos, and thus it turns it into, quote, a meal. Now, by Chabad custom, we don't have Shalosh Shabbos at all, although the Rebbe Rashab says you should have something, including fruit. So, following that logic, again, this is all my own conjecture, and I'm sure it's discussed by many other Chabad rabbis who analyze these words here, and I'm sure many have different conclusions than I do. But perhaps following that logic, and considering out there but doesn't use the terminology you sit and establish a meal, but rather sitting and eating, which is a lighter term, then so long as the fruit you're eating is in such a manner that you're sitting at a table to do so, it would seem like you can continue eating because you started permissibly, which essentially would be our Shalosh Shabbos. Because we sat down to eat and hear Divrei Torah. We sat down to eat and hear words of Chassidus, right? So we are sitting to eat, even if we aren't establishing a meal. We're certainly sitting at a table.
So the concern about having whatever it is, having to stop it, I don't know exactly.
Right. So it depends when we do mincha. Depends when we do mincha.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. But as you mentioned yesterday, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about this on Friday, that there is an opinion which says to begin with, you're allowed to start eating
Right.
after sunset, even though the primary opinion doesn't follow them, but there's something to rely on. So I don't know. We have to stop everyone from eating during the Shalosh Shabbos.
So the term is stretching your Shabbos.
Sorry.
You're stretching your Shabbos.
So long as you started your meal, so long as you started eating early enough that it's still completely fully Shabbos, meaning before sunset. But the question was, does this apply to mezainis? And I'm assuming that the answer is correct. And the answer is yes, considering the Alter Rebbe's language, where he refrains from using the term kavasudasa, you established your meal, which is usually the term used to describe washing, as opposed to here he uses the language yoshev oichel, you're sitting and eating.
But certainly.
So that's my reading. Yeah.
Certainly, let's say it's finished with the whatever you said.
Then
At that point, you can't.
you may not. Yes, correct.
That's it.
You may not eat or drink until Havdalah. Yes, correct.
Right.
Okay. So more details about that. Let's go to halacha daled then. So in halacha 3 we said.
It also says, like, talked about it last time, but even if you're not eating, even if you're just still drinking, you can continue.
Wait, no. If you're eating, then you can continue drinking.
Yeah.
Because your drinking gets extended to your eating. But if you're
done
only sitting and
eating,
drinking, your drinking has to stop.
Yeah, but if you're done, you're snacking.
Even though you're not eating, that's
and you
correct.
keep drinking.
Even though
keep
you're
going.
that's right. Even though you're done eating, but because your drinking began in your eating, you can continue drinking. Right? We established that.
So
That's
can-
right.
Can you do Havdalah in the morning?
Oh, we're gonna get there.
If you're,
We're not gonna discuss that today. We're gonna do the Gemara. Oh, if you're eating the entire time,
let's say you're in
A 12-hour Farbrengen.
Farbrengen.
and if I bring in lasts for 12 hours,
Yeah.
First of all, kudos to you for taking the Fabring for 12 hours.
Yeah.
But yes, you could make Havdalah in the morning. That's the answer, short answer. But the subject of making Havdalah Sunday and Monday, Tuesday, we'll get to that
Yeah.
in the next section of the Gemara.
You
So we're going to put a pause on that because we're going to get to that. Sorry? Okay, we're going to get to that. The next subject in the Gemara is going to be the issue of making Havdalah later. And then we'll come back to the Shulchan Aruch to discuss that as well. But now we're talking about the prohibition against eating. Okay, the last thing we said was, in Halacha 3, is that if you were eating permissibly, so you began before sunset, and your meal continues going into nightfall as you're allowed, and in the middle someone says, you know what, let's make Havdalah. Let's do Havdalah. But then you decide, you know what, one more L'chaim. You don't have to make a new bracha on that extra L'chaim, because saying you want to make Havdalah doesn't end your meal. If you said, hey, let's bench, that would have ended your meal. Just by saying, hey, let's bench. That ends your meal. And you have to make a new bracha on the food that you eat after that decision to bench. The halachas of which are complex and involved, and we discussed some of it a while back. But saying, that's right.
I think even chrono on it.
Depends when and what. We'll leave that alone for now. But if you said, let's make Havdalah, that doesn't constitute ending your meal. And if you decide to change your mind, not make Havdalah, you can keep on eating without making a new bracha. This is halacha dalet, gimel. Now halacha dalet. So the person sat to drink when he was allowed to, let's just say, and it comes time for Havdalah and he has to stop because it's not eating, it's drinking, and drinking has to be stopped in order to make Havdalah, right? Even though he established his sitting for the express purpose of only drinking, they sat down for a glass of wine. Where he now has the obligation to stop drinking and make Havdalah when nightfall hits. Right? Because only eating is allowed to be extended till after, but drinking has to stop. And therefore it's forbidden for him to continue drinking until he makes Havdalah. Right? So now the question becomes, I made Hagafen already. I'm stopping now to make Havdalah. Do I have to make a new Hagafen when I make Havdalah? I've been drinking wine. I'm stopping as per the requirement to stop to make Havdalah. Should I make Hagafen or not? Your vote is?
Me?
Yeah.
Logical dictate that you put.
Have to make Hagafen.
Yeah.
What's the rationale?
You finish your meal.
No, I'm continuing to drink afterwards, let's say.
No, but you benched.
Why am I benching?
Well, you didn't bench on the, wait a minute.
You were just drinking.
I was drinking wine.
When were you doing that?
Before, yeah. Or let's say I'm following the opinion that says I'm allowed to drink between Ben Moshes. Yes, but I didn't eat, and therefore the moment my obligation of Havdalah comes, I'm required to stop and make Havdalah.
But you had no intention to say Havdalah when you had the wine.
Okay, but I intended to drink wine. And the wine I'm holding. Okay, so there is, one might have thought that, but nonetheless, he should not make, we're not done yet. You should not make Hagafen in your Havdalah. Because you've already exempted yourself from the obligation of making B'er Hagafen from the first glass of wine you drank. Even though there was temporarily a time in which it was forbidden to drink. That is, from when nightfall hits, until it makes Havdalah. So the rationale is like this. And this is going to come up, since we're learning psachim, this is going to come up later. Right? We talked about the 4 cups of wine. We mentioned this once. Hold on a second. Wait, let's explain. And the halacha there is that every one of the 4 cups of wine we make a new hagafen. When we get there, we're going to see that there's different opinions as to why and when you should make a hagafen each time. Now, one of the ways of thinking about it is that if you're forbidden to drink between 1 cup and another, that constitutes an interruption, and therefore you have to make a hagafen again. So when you make kiddush on cup number 1, and then you get into the Haggadah, during the Haggadah you may not drink wine. So you've interrupted from your first drinking, and therefore when it comes to cup 2, you got to make hagafen again. Okay, the end is, as we'll see, there's a different reason why we make hagafen each time, but there is the view that says that this is the reason why you make hagafen each time. Follow? Because there was a time period when you were not allowed to drink. Right? We have this halacha that if you, in your mind, have detached yourself from your eating or drinking, you have to make a new bracha when you start again. Right? That was the principle of, hey, let's bench. And then you decide to eat again, you have to make a new bracha when you decide to eat again because you made an interruption in your meal. So if the halacha imposes an interruption on you, because halacha says you're not allowed to drink now, that's an interruption. And you would think, logically, as Jacob is pointing out, that you would have to make a new hagafen when you drink again. Says Dal Rebbe, no. At least in this opinion. And therefore, on Shabbos afternoon, if you made hagafen, let's say you follow the opinion which says you're allowed to make hagafen after sunset, and now nightfall hits, you're not allowed to drink until you make Havdalah. So you pick up your cup, make Havdalah, skipping the bracha hagafen, because you already made hagafen 10 minutes ago on your, or 5 minutes ago, or whatever, on your first cup of wine you drink. Clear?
That's completely what's going
And counterintuitive.
counterintuitive.
We're not done yet. Okay, and therefore, needless to say, if you started eating while it was still daytime, and you keep, which then for sure you're allowed to keep on going in your meal, and then you come to make Havdalah on wine. Let's say at the end of your meal, or middle of your meal. Let's say you decide you want to. No, not at the end of your meal. You started your meal kosher. You kept on going, right? So the farbrengen still going.
You paused.
But someone around the room decides he wants to have a cigarette. So, but he didn't want to end the farbrengen. So he's going to make Havdalah in the middle of his meal. Right? So now he's making Havdalah in the middle of the meal, but he's going to keep on going. No problem with that. He does not have to make hagafen on his cup of Havdalah if in his course of his meal he already made a hagafen. Or at the beginning of his meal he already made a hagafen. Right? So if the farbrengen continues till Mata Shabbos, and this guy is drinking wine at the farbrengen, and he decides he wants to stop Shabbos for whatever reason, he wants to have a cigarette, then he makes Havdalah without hagafen. Because even he does so even if he didn't eat a meal, he was just drinking wine. How much more so if he's having a meal, which he's allowed to continue going, and if he makes Havdalah in the middle, no hagafen because he already covered hagafen earlier.
He allowed to make it. Sorry.
One at a time, yeah.
You're allowed to eat all the time between the.
So again, he started eating before sunset, so he's allowed to continue going. He's allowed to continue eating.
Making Havdalah for? Just because it's dark out?
Because he wants a cigarette, whatever, who cares why he's making Havdalah? He wants to play music.
Or let's say one person is leaving.
Yeah, because if you don't say Havdalah, there's certain things you cannot do.
Right, so he wants to do those things. But he wants to continue his meal.
Yes.
Because you made a Havdalah in Ma'ariv. The reason why one second, hold on a second. Let's make it clear. One second. Not this guy.
Yes. So why is he, how can he say Havdalah?
Why not?
I have no idea.
So he is. He is.
I figure, but Havdalah is only after
No, he's doing it before Ma'ariv.
it's
The Havdalah, the obligation for Ma'ariv and the obligation to make Havdalah on a cup of wine are two separate obligations. And in the middle of his meal, he's making Havdalah. This is not. It's not an uncommon occurrence during farbrengen that people will do this. In the middle of farbrengen, make Havdalah when Mat Shabbos sits because he wants to play music, because he wants to whatever he wants to do. I don't know why he's example of a cigarette, but whatever, he wants to play music. What's the difference?
Yeah. In that case, then would you say Anantana and
In Ma'ariv later?
After you already did it with the verse, right? You said
I think the answer is no.
Separation.
I think the answer is no.
Right. That's a good question.
It's a good question. Okay, well, we'll put a pin in that. What did you do to Ma'ariv? We'll put a pin in that. Okay, we'll put a pin in that.
Yeah.
But in the city, the answer will be there. What do you want to say? That was one.
I'm saying, so in all these cases, though, but if the person made bracha of Corona after the wine, then for sure.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second. We'll get there. We'll get there in a second. We'll get there with the bracha chorena. Here he's not making a bracha chorena because he wants to continue his meal, but he just wants to make Havdalah in the middle.
You're allowed to continue.
Sorry, you're allowed to continue because you started early enough. Correct.
Because you don't have to say it.
You don't have to. You don't have to stop. 1 second. Again, if you're drinking before, you do have to stop.
You stop it. You're not ending your meal.
Hold on a second. If you're not eating before Shabbos, and you're only drinking during Shabbos, then you have to stop when Havdalah time comes.
Yes.
And now, even then, you don't have to make a bracha hagafen if what you were drinking earlier was hagafen. How much more so if you started out in a meal where you're allowed to keep on going and drinking and eating, but you just decide to make Havdalah, how much more so you don't have to make hagafen, considering that there was never a time when you weren't allowed to drink wine. There it is. Clear? No? Where are we stuck, Alan?
Stuck with Ma'ariv.
Let's put Ma'ariv aside for a second. I want to remind you that when we cannot ask from our practice onto what we're learning, because our practice is derived from what we are learning. So you can't ask on a question on what it says here and says, hey, well, we do it differently. What we do comes from what it says here. So let's put Ma'ariv aside here. He's going to daven Ma'ariv later, and whatever the halachas of that are, we'll deal with later. But we're talking about this meal now, right? It's important to remember. We cannot ask halachas, we cannot ask questions on what we're learning from our observance. Our observance is derived from what it says here. So asking a question from what we do onto what it says is backward. Right? It's the reverse. What it says here is correct, and then what we practice is derived from what it says here. So let's put Ma'ariv aside for a minute, and what the halachas of Ma'ariv maybe we'll deal with later. Let's look at the halachas here. Yeah, clear? Let's keep on going now. Okay, so let's get these two points clear. Two scenarios, yeah. Two scenarios, one halacha. Two scenarios, one halacha. Scenario A, he started eating before nightfall. Totally allowed. He doesn't have to stop for Ma'ariv because he's eating. He keeps on going. For whatever reason, in the middle of his meal, he wants to end Shabbos, say, makes Havdalah. Because that meal had Hagafen already, no need to make Hagafen in his Havdalah. Point A. Scenario 2, with same halacha, is if I was not eating while Shabbos was going. I was drinking while Shabbos was going. Where the halacha is that as soon as time for Havdalah comes, I may not drink until I make Havdalah. Yet, because I made Hagafen earlier, I don't have to make Hagafen in my Havdalah. Even though the halacha is telling me, hey, stop drinking. Okay, so two scenarios, same halacha.
But you still have to say Ma'ariv before you do it.
No, you don't.
No.
Again, you don't have to make a Ma'ariv before Havdalah. Don't.
That's new.
You should, because you're not supposed
But
to.
it's time for the thing, right? You just said 10 minutes ago that when the obligation comes, you have to do that
Yeah.
obligation. right?
So if you have a minion set later, you don't have to do Havdalah right. You don't have to do Ma'ariv right away. And moreover, as we'll see in a minute, you can do Ma'ariv in the middle of your meal and keep on going back to your meal also.
He has to say.
So let's just say, okay, you know what? Let's just say you made Havdalah. Let's say you did that Ma'ariv.
You did or did not?
Let's say you did. Same halacha still applied because you're in the middle of your meal. You're having Ma'ariv middle of your meal, which you're allowed to do.
That's right.
Which we learned earlier.
So the same halacha still applies. You still have to make Havdalah without Hagafen. Even if you did throw Ma'ariv in there. The halacha still doesn't change. Let's just say you establish that all of you guys are going to do a minion later. Yeah? Or let's say you did Ma'ariv then. The halacha still remains the same. Okay? One more paragraph.
But doesn't Ma'ariv close off? Isn't there a paragraph in Ma'ariv that closes off?
Yeah, you're
The mundane
no,
from
I
the-
mean, that's
It doesn't end your meal just because you ended the mundane from the weekday.
But you're also saying.
Why does it end your meal
Also
though?
saying that when Shabbos is finished.
Okay, but my meal is not. So Shabbos is finished, but my meal is not. It's the same thing we're talking about. This is this whole new halacha we're learning here, which is remember we discussed this. Remember we just discussed this. A person starts his meal Friday afternoon, right? And Shabbos comes in the middle of his meal. What does he do? He pauses and makes kiddush, right? New day doesn't mean new meal. They're two separate things that happen to be happening at the same time. So we have structured our observance to avoid this confusion and to eat at its proper times and to make it with a whole structure and order. But again, we're like asking questions on the halacha based on our practice, which is there to avoid the problems of these halachas, right? So we're asking it backwards. We're reverse engineering. You can't ask on the reverse engineering from the conclusions, right? We're asking it backwards. What we do is built out of all these things. Because of all these confusions, therefore we've structured our system that we avoid these problems. But these problems are still existing that undergird what made the decisions for us to do what we do. So don't like ask questions. Hey, but we do it otherwise. Of course we do it otherwise because we're avoiding these issues, right?
If we do, I do Shabbat, let's say sometimes at my parents' house. So Saturday, I don't know, 5, 6 o'clock, we're around the table. My dad will start drinking a bit, let's say, or eat or whatever. Sunset comes, now it's sundown, Shabbat's out, and I say, okay, I need to take the kids home, we need to leave.
Yeah.
He can just right away do Havdalah, doesn't need to do Bolvei, I guess, because we started before,
Yeah.
and that's it. And then he can continue drinking. And
Yeah. Without making in this opinion, well, it's another opinion, but in this opinion. Yeah.
What? Now your meal is in between two different sanctities, right?
Why is that a problem?
I'm not saying it's a problem. I'm just saying it's a reality.
So
You start a meal when it was Shabbos, and you're going to end the meal when it's a mundane.
okay.
So, but there's inserts in brachas, bracha
Okay, you wouldn't make the inserts. What if you make Havdalah? So you ended your Shabbos, you wouldn't make the inserts for Shabbos. If you didn't make Havdalah, you would make the inserts because you've extended your Shabbos. So
Right.
in this case, where you're making
Once
Havdalah
you
middle,
make Havdalah, then when you
correct.
go back and do bracha,
That's correct.
you don't add the inserts for Shabbos.
Correct. In this scenario where you made Havdalah and ended your Shabbos in the middle of your meal continues, no problem. But because you've ended your Shabbos, when it comes to your bracha, you would not make the inserts for Shabbos. Correct. Had you not done that, then your Shabbos would continue. You would make the inserts. Okay, one more paragraph, and then tomorrow we'll get to the counter opinion. Yeah, because nothing can be simple. We have to have counter opinions, just in case this wasn't simple enough. Okay, In case it wasn't complex enough.
Probably not.
Now, what if you're making Havdalah on beer? Which you shouldn't, but you are.
Well, the big issue last night.
Saturday night this week. Yeah.
Yes. Because then people were waiting. I was supposed to make a bill. I got breakfast and everyone's waiting. I show up, Freddy's there with a glass of beer and pouring the thing of beer. What are you doing beer? No kid under 13. Yeah, but if there's no kid,
You drink the wine, is correct.
right. So I wasn't ready at that point in front of 400 people. Tell them, hey, you can't do it.
Yeah.
But I knew.
Yeah. But you should know this. The halacha is you're always okay. We'll leave it alone. Let's just finish the paragraph. Let's finish this before we get there. Okay. If he's drinking, if he's making Havdalah on beer, right? So he's making Havdalah on beer. It's mid meal, and he doesn't make the bracha shakal. No. The same way you didn't make havgafen. If you made havgafen in your meal, then you're not making shakal. If it's in the middle of a meal.
Otherwise,
Now this is even if you never made shakal in your meal. Why? The bracha hamotzi always covers shakal. When you start your meal with hamotzi, you never make any other bracha other than hagafen. In this case, you're making shakal. So your hamotzi of your meal covered your shakal of your Havdalah. Just like it covers any other beer you might be drinking in the middle of your meal.
Is there a time frame?
What's the point? Sorry?
There's a time frame also when you can, let's say you have a cup of coffee sitting at your desk. It's such a hustle. And it's still sitting there at lunchtime.
Separate discussion, which we discussed already a while back about the separations in meals, but there's a different issue here.
But no, because if he started his meal Shabbos and he had his coffin or whatever it is that he had, and he's going on and on and on and on, and Havdalah.
You're imagining he's going on and on and on and on. It could have been a question of 5 minutes. It could have been a question of 3 minutes. You're introducing another issue, which is a time break between a meal. Separate discussion. Here we're talking about, it's a question of literally 30 seconds. Before Shabbos, after Shabbos.
Fine.
It's a question of 2 minutes.
Okay,
It doesn't have to be a long time. We have to introduce another variable. In other words, we're introducing another variable that has another halacha. No reason to do that right now. Because here we're talking about 2 variables. The variable of Shabbos and the variable of eating.
No, but
Your meal is normal.
But we're assuming he's sitting in such a and he's going on from the beginning.
So why are you assuming they stopped to eat for so long?
Didn't stop to eat, but he started a while.
So what?
And now Havdalah's coming. It's
So
an
what?
hour later.
So what?
Okay.
Play it out. Well, what's the problem?
Fine.
It's a regular.
Not making.
It's as long and as regular as your normal meal you'd always have. On a regular Tuesday, why is it taking longer just because it happens to be Havdalah in the middle? Why are you adding more time into it?
But
You
it's
understand what I'm saying?
His father, depending on when he sits down. Even
Just
if
like a regular
it's
Tuesday
2
depends when you
hours,
sit down.
fine.
It's a very, one second. My point is you're introducing a variable that's unrelated to the issue at hand. It's a variable that's true of any meal. How much time are you making between your brachas and your eating? It's irrelevant to the question of Motzei Shabbos. Right? Between before Shabbos and after Shabbos can be a question of 3 minutes.
Could be.
It could be 20, but it also could be 20 on Tuesday. It's a variable that isn't relevant to follow. So let's not introduce it then, because it's going to make complicated for another reason, for no reason. You follow what I'm saying?
No, because after a certain point, you have.
Again, but that's not relevant to Motzei Shabbos. That's true of any meal.
Oh, it's relevant depending on when you started.
On Tuesday also. It's relevant to.
Also.
So why is it being brought up now? We follow? Understand what I'm saying? Exactly. We're learning the halachas of a meal Motzei Shabbos. You're talking about the halachas of how much time between your food and your benching. That has nothing to do with the meal Motzei Shabbos. It has to do with the meal period.
Okay.
So it's a third variable. It's irrelevant. It could be relevant, but it could also be relevant on Monday. It's not relevant to the particulars of the question we're dealing with here.
If you're avoiding making a broth on the beer, avoiding making broth on the wine, I just thought that it makes a difference of when.
It does, but it's not relevant to the halacha here. Because there's 1,000 other halachas to the meal. Did you have a dessert? Did you not have a dessert? Did you say let's bench? Did you not say let's bench? Did you have to go to the bathroom? You're not going to the bathroom. There's 1,000 halachas, but they aren't relevant because there are variables that are relevant to any meal. And here specifically, we're talking about 2 variables. A, meal, assuming your meal is normal. B, transition from Shabbos to weekday. And does one have an effect on the other? And to what degree does one have an effect on the other? That's the question at hand. Right? And the answer is they do have an effect on each other. Insofar as part of your Havdalah ceremony is to drink. That drinking is part and parcel of your meal, notwithstanding the fact that it happens to be accompanied by Havdalah. And as a result, because it's part and parcel of your meal, don't make any irrelevant brachas. If your wine was made, if your hagafen was made, don't make a hagafen. And if it's shahakal, it's covered by hamaitzi or a shahakal. Because the Havdalah is a separate issue from the bracha of your drinking the wine over which you made Havdalah, or beer over which you made Havdalah.
The wine is like
The wine and your beer is part and parcel of your meal, even though it happens to be attached to Havdalah. And even though that Havdalah happens to change your Shabbos to weekday. But your meal still is normal, and your hagafen or your beer or your shahakal that's attached to your Havdalah is part and parcel of your regular meal, is the point. Yeah? Good.
If you had a hamotzi meal, but you didn't drink wine during that meal, and then you had to do Havdalah, you stopped to do Havdalah.
Say that again. I missed that.
If you did you made hamotzi, but you didn't do a bracha on hagafen,
Yeah,
and then you went and did Havdalah.
on wine.
You'd have to do the bracha.
Then you would make hagafen. Because there's nothing in your meal that would cover your hagafen.
Once you cover
Unlike
the-
shahakol,
Unlike shahakal, which is covered by a hamaitzi. Yes. Okay, quickly. There are those who disagree with this completely. There are those that say Havdalah is completely independent. And therefore, when you make Havdalah, you have to make all the brachas, including shahakal, including hagafen. Even though it happens to be in the middle of your meal, and even though in your meal you made hagafen, and even though all the hagafen in your meal is covered, and all the shahakal in your meal is covered, Havdalah is independent. Other opinion. Therefore, it's best in the first case scenario. Don't make Havdalah until you've benched. And then you close out your meal. Not on beer, not on wine. Even if you already made if you made a hagafen in your meal earlier. If you didn't make a hagafen in your meal earlier, no problem making a hagafen on your Havdalah. But if you did make hagafen in your meal, now you're running into an issue of this dispute. Should I be making hagafen on my Havdalah because it's independent? Or should I not be making hagafen on my Havdalah because the bracha hagafen is part of my meal, even though it happens to be making Havdalah? And therefore, best case scenario, bench first. Now,
and that's not putting off Havdalah unnecessarily.
It's fine. It's part of a mitzvah. It's part of a meal. You're allowed to make Havdalah as late as you want. But what if Havdalah? What if you do want to make Havdalah? You're really stuck now because you really need to listen to that song. Right? Whatever. You need to turn on the light. Whatever it is you want to do. Before you bench. And you want to continue your meal. In first case scenario, you should make Havdalah, right?
You could, in emergency.
But in this case, you have wine sitting in front of you, you shouldn't really do that. Right? Or
that's what he's saying.
what? He's saying in best case scenario, you should wait till after you bench before you make Havdalah. But it so happens that you need to make Havdalah and you're not stopping your meal.
Yeah, but how could you bench after?
Why not?
It's part of the Havdalah.
Let's keep on going back.
The same thing.
Keep going back to the same point. You have two rituals that are unrelated to each other. They happen to be happening at the same time. Your meal and your Havdalah. They're independent, unrelated issues that so happen to converge. So why was one impose anything on the other? Just do them both.
Because you got to stand up.
So stand up.
And sometimes you have to go away from the bed. You can't do Havdalah over all the food.
Why not? Why not? Again, you're imagining how you do Havdalah, which is the correct way to do it, because we're trying to avoid this and asking it on these scenarios.
You have to remember the halacha came before.
Exactly, the halacha came before what you do. So why not make Havdalah in front of a whole meal? No problem.
There's no restriction.
That's what we do Saturday night. When I'm like, okay,
Exactly. Pause your meal, make Havdalah middle. Here the question is, do I make hagafen, considering that hagafen is not an issue of Havdalah, it's an issue of eating.
I was always in the impression that as soon as you finish eating, you bench.
But you're not finished eating here. You're just pausing for Havdalah.
It just became interposed.
Exactly, but you didn't stop your meal, you're continuing to go.
Doesn't necessarily affect.
Right? So best case scenario is you should finish your meal. And the only reason is because there is an opinion which says you're stuck in a question, should I make hagafen or not make hagafen? So to avoid issues, bench, and then you have to make hagafen according to all opinions. Sorry?
To avoid a potential making
Correct.
bracha in vain.
Correct. And also remember, the bracha hagafen is not over the end of Shabbos. It's over a cup of wine, like you do anytime you drink a cup of wine. And it so happens you already made hagafen. It just happens to be that on this glass of wine, I'm making Havdalah.
So if you're eating and it goes right into the night,
Yeah.
and then you start with the Verbringen, right? After the Verbringen, you can bench and then do Havdalah.
That's what you should do. But here we're talking about a guy who's making Havdalah in the middle of the Farbrengen.
Because for whatever reason,
But after hours after you finished eating, like the
Why is it
main
hours
thing,
after you finish eating?
I'm
You're still
talking about
eating.
the
If you're
meal.
again, if you're sitting by the Farbrengen, you're still considered eating. You haven't left your meal yet. And you're making Havdalah later. That would be the best, actually.
It's like,
But here's an issue: the guy's making Havdalah in the middle of the Farbrengen.
it's like Kiddush, right? When you start your meal, when Kiddush arrives, you
Exactly.
cover your bread.
It's exactly why the Gemara introduced it.
And then you
That's correct. That's why the
come
Gemara.
back to your meal.
That's why the Gemara introduced it.
Rabbi Yossi.
Right? Again, we do it differently because we're avoiding these issues, but we're still learning the halachas of the hypothetical of someone who does do this. Yeah. Okay. So let's conclude. So Imur writes al-Havdal, if he wants to make Havdalah in the middle of his meal, doesn't want to bench yet. Right? So best case scenario, he should bench first and then make Havdalah. And that way he definitely has to make a hagafen and he avoids the question of whether a hagafen should be done mid-meal. Or he was only drinking, he was not eating before Shabbos is over. Where the halacha says you have to stop drinking and make Havdalah. Because only a meal may continue to be after Shabbos. But drinking must stop.
It says meal?
I'm sorry, eating, not meal. You should not make, you shouldn't make the bracha on the cup over which you make Havdalah, according to the first opinion, which is the primary. Which means the primary opinion is that the hagafen you make of Havdalah is covered by whatever hagafen you may have made earlier, unless you benched first. So to avoid the opinion which disagrees, bench first. But if you're not benching first, and you're making Havdalah mid-Farbrengen or mid-meal, whatever it is, don't make hagafen if you already made one earlier. Or if you're drinking shahako, if you're drinking a beer, don't make a bracha shahako because it's covered by your meal anyway. Clear?
If you make
So-
motzi.
You made a motzi or you made chocolate earlier.
So getting back to the eating.
Yeah.
You could eat right through
Yes,
and right into a Farbrengen.
correct.
And in the middle of the Farbrengen, let's say you want to listen to music from Niggin.
Correct.
Niggins, you want to sing Niggins with the music.
So you make
Then
Havdalah.
you make Havdalah.
Correct.
And when you make Havdalah, you're making it for the whole table.
Correct. Otazai.
You-
We learned something
What does that
new.
mean?
Otazai.
What does that mean?
Which means exactly like that. Yiddish. Beautiful. So we learned the halacha. Beautiful.
Ah, that was
We have to like drop our presuppositions.
Well, because we're doing certain.
Because we do things so long, but we have to remember that this is where it comes from. Okay, good day, Yidden.
Good day.